today's episode, we examine how a climber hired a budget Sherpa on Everest, convinced the cheaper option carried the same risks as a full expedition. High on the mountain, it was clear he had no idea what he had actually paid for. That ignorance hardened into a dumb, irreversible mistake. It was May 19, 2016, at the south col of Mount Everest, where climbers prepared to leave Camp 4 and move on to the upper ridge. Wind cut across the tents and pressed through layered clothing. Headlamps reduced the world to short tunnels of light. Oxygen regulators released a steady hiss that blended into the background noise of the camp. From a distance, the system appeared intact. The fixed lines were in place. The queue was moving, and conditions were still within what the schedule allowed. At this altitude, routine can continue even after a critical failure has already been introduced. Leo Vance was 44 years old, a structural engineer from outside Columbus, Ohio. He worked for a regional firm that designed small bridges, parking structures, and commercial retrofits, spending his days evaluating loads, margins, and failure points. He approached risk as something measurable and controllable when information was accurate. He was not an extreme athlete and avoided improvisation. At his local climbing gym, he was known for following instructions precisely, double-checking knots, and relying on checklists rather than instinct. Over 5 years, he saved for a $32,000 commercial Everest expedition by setting aside bonuses and tax refunds. Leo's father died at 51 from a sudden heart attack, a loss that left Leo convinced his own body carried a clock. He began climbing in his late 30s and treated it as conditioning rather than thrill-seeking, training methodically with weighted stair climbs, long Appalachian hikes, and annual trips to Colorado for snow and ice practice. He approached the sport the way he approached engineering, adding margin, avoiding improvisation, and deferring to established expertise. Choosing a commercial Everest expedition was part of that logic. An experienced guide was meant to be the final safety layer he could not create himself. The south side route of Everest was familiar to him in structure, if not experience. It functioned as a managed corridor of fixed lines, ladders, and staged camps. The Khumbu icefall relied on anchored ladders. The western CWM punished dehydration under heat and thin air. The Lhotse face forced climbers upward on fixed ropes. And above the south col, the ridge narrowed into exposed terrain where fatigue and wind magnified small errors. His equipment matched a standard commercial summit attempt, nothing unusual and effective only if the system was used by someone who understood it. Leo chose a budget commercial agency because it offered the same summit promise for less money. The savings came from tighter staffing, shared resources, and fewer safeguards behind the scenes. When he arrived at Everest Base Camp on May 14th, after the long Khumbu approach, he was tired but confident in what he believed he had purchased. His contract named Dawa Tenzing as his personal guide, described as a 12-time Everest summiteer. The agency's website showed Dawa as a seasoned Sherpa in his 40s, someone who had already made the hardest decisions on the mountain and survived them. For Leo, that name mattered. It was the justification for choosing a cheaper operator, while still believing the most dangerous calls would be handled by real experience. What Leo did not know was that Dawa was never coming up the mountain. A back injury had kept him in Kathmandu for the entire season, and the agency chose not to say anything. The budget setup left little room for refunds or delays, and losing one client could wipe out profits from several others. High on Everest, where everyone wears masks, goggles, and the same bulky down suits, it is hard to tell who is who. The agency counted on that. Instead of canceling the climb or reassigning clients openly, they quietly swapped the guide after the expedition was already underway. On paper, nothing changed. The same guide name stayed on the contract. In reality, the person meant to handle route choices, weather calls, and life or death decisions was replaced by someone who only looked qualified. Leo never saw a clear warning because the system was built to hide it. By choosing a budget operator, he entered a setup where critical roles could be changed without notice. and the mountain was where that choice was finally tested. The substitute was Pema, a 19-year-old cousin of the agency owner. He was not a certified high-altitude guide. He had never climbed above 8,000 meters and had never been responsible for route decisions, navigation, or client safety in the death zone. To complete the substitution, Pema was given Dawa's old down suit and told to keep his face covered at all times. On Everest, where everyone wears goggles, masks, and identical layers of fabric, the suit became the identity. To anyone behind him on a rope, Pema looked exactly like the guide Leo believed he had hired. From the start, Pema moved carefully and stayed close to senior Sherpas, copying what they did and repeating instructions he had been given. Leo had no reason to suspect that the person in front of him was not who the contract promised. More importantly, he did not want to suspect it. He believed he had paid for expertise, and that belief shaped how he interpreted every warning sign that followed. The early climbs made the problem easy to miss. Fixed ropes showed everyone exactly where to go. Daily routines were predictable, and climbers moved through the same narrow lanes of traffic. At Camp 2, Pema had trouble setting his ascender correctly and had to watch another Sherpa show him how to seat the cam on the rope. On the Lhotse face, his oxygen mask sat loose, letting moisture from his breath freeze around the regulator until airflow dropped. He moved quickly but without a steady rhythm, wasting energy. In a crowded season, those mistakes looked like normal fatigue and altitude stress. Leo read them that way and continued to depend on the person leading him. Everything above base camp was driven by schedule pressure. Weather briefings focused on opportunity and cost. Missing a summit window meant burning extra oxygen, eating through supplies, paying staff for more days, and dealing with refund requests. On May 18th, climbers were told that wind and cloud were expected to build after midday on the 19th, but it was framed as a caution, not a hard cutoff. Leo assumed his guide would recognize when conditions crossed the line and would enforce a turnaround. That assumption was part of the service he believed he had purchased. It let him hand off judgment when thinking clearly was already becoming harder. At Camp 4 on the South Col, comfort disappeared. The air was so thin that simply sitting upright sent heart rate racing. Oxygen systems had to run continuously. Moisture could freeze inside hoses and regulators. Masks could leak if straps shifted even slightly. Bottles had to be swapped while hands shook and vision narrowed. Mistakes that would be harmless lower on the mountain became life-threatening because the body had no reserve left. Leo checked his gear methodically, the way he checked calculations at work, and continued to rely on the guide to manage the terrain and decisions he could no longer safely evaluate himself. They left Camp 4 around 12:30 a.m., stepping into the line that led toward the balcony and the south summit. Leo and Pema were tied close together on a short rope, a low-cost method used to keep clients from drifting or falling behind. The rope ran through a single locking carabiner on Pema's harness before connecting to Leo, with almost no slack between them. Short roping keeps two people close, but it also means they share balance. If one person slips, the force transfers instantly to the other. In extreme cold, metal becomes brittle, and when a sudden load hits a single connection point, weak or poorly rated gear can fail instead of absorbing the force. Safer systems spread that load across multiple anchors. Leo clipped his ascender onto the fixed rope, stepped up, slid it higher, and repeated the same motion over and over. The system appeared stable, which made it easier to keep climbing than to stop and question the person leading him. As the hours passed and morning turned into midday, the mountain slowed everyone down. The line tightened. When one climber stopped, everyone stopped. Long pauses became common. The change was subtle. Judgment began to feel confident even as thinking slowed. Leo felt numbness creep into his fingers despite thick mitts and stiffness. At this altitude, panic does not always look like fear. It often looks like speed, like someone pushing forward because stopping feels worse. By early afternoon, they were close to the summit. That closeness pulled them higher even as conditions worsened. Blowing snow flattened the landscape, erasing depth and direction. What had once been a clear ridge shrank to a few visible steps. The fixed rope was harder to find where it was iced over or buried. Climbers stacked up at narrow sections, forcing long waits followed by short, hurried moves. A turnaround time existed on the plan, but plans only work when someone enforces them. That required a guide who could read terrain, recognize danger through whiteout, and stop upward movement. Pema did not have that skill. He believed his job was to keep Leo moving. Leo believed his job was to trust the guide in front of him. Around 2:15 in the afternoon, less than 100 meters below the summit, a dark cloud slammed into the ridge without warning. The light collapsed into a flat, colorless gray. Wind surged hard enough to shake bodies and tear sound away, drowning out shouted warnings and the scrape of metal on ice. Snow blasted sideways, sticking to goggles and freezing instantly, shrinking the world to a few blurred shapes. Nothing obvious broke. The mountain simply reduced everything until only the next step felt real. The safe response was plain and unglamorous. Stop, wait for the wind to pass, and use a compass or GPS to find the line again. That meant standing still in brutal cold, burning oxygen, slowing everyone behind them, and admitting the summit push was slipping away. Pema chose to move. He edged sideways, feeling for ground that sloped down, assuming it was the descent back toward the South Col. In a whiteout, the shift from narrow ridge to open face is subtle and deadly. Leo could see only the broad orange back in front of him. The wind erased all other sound. The rope behind them was gone under snow. Leo followed because his entire plan rested on one belief. The person leading him knew where they were. By the time that belief mattered, the ground beneath them was no longer the route. During a brief lull, the haze thinned just enough for the climber to raise a helmet camera. The footage later showed two orange figures moving sideways across the slope instead of up the ridge. The clip lasted seconds, but it captured the mistaken motion. Pema stepped onto a stretch of blue ice polished smooth by constant wind. In the flat light, it looked like firm snow. His crampon points skated instead of biting. His feet slid out from under him, and his body pitched downhill. He threw his ice axe down on instinct, but the pick struck at a shallow angle and skipped off the surface. The slip became a fall in an instant. The rope between him and Leo snapped tight like a whip. Leo's foot was planted, his weight committed, but the force hit too fast. There was no time to brace, no time to cut loose. The mountain took both of them at once. They accelerated almost immediately. The surface beneath them was hard, polished ice with patches of bare rock. Their down suits and packs skimmed across it like plastic on glass. Leo drove his ice axe down in a reflex, but the pick struck a rock edge and bounced, sending a violent jolt up his arm. The rope between them snapped tight, then loose, then tight again. The sound was a dull, hollow scraping, mixed with the snap of fabric tearing. They slid roughly 40 meters toward the break in the ridge, where the mountain drops away into the north face. Wind erased depth and direction. What felt like a slope was already a cliff. Pema hit a rock ledge first. The impact twisted his body sideways and smashed the carabiner at his harness directly into stone. The blow knocked the air from him and spun him against the rock where the ledge slowed him, just enough to stop the slide. Snow packed into his clothing as he was pressed hard against the wall. The rope between them went tight at a sharp angle. All the force ran through a single piece of metal, loaded sideways, exactly how it should never be used. Leo slid past him and over the edge. He did not drop cleanly. He was thrown onto a steep, broken slope of rock and hard ice and began tumbling end over end. His left side struck first, whipping his body around. The down suit ripped open along his hip and thigh as sharp stone shredded the fabric. Feathers burst out in a white cloud and vanished into the wind. The next impact snapped his right leg above the boot, bone punching into muscle. Ribs collapsed and drove into his lungs and heart. There was no pause, no chance to slow. Each hit fed into the next, carrying him faster and farther down. The rock stripped him like coarse sandpaper. As the suit came apart, skin was ground away, down to muscle along his torso and legs. One glove snagged on a projection and wrenched his wrist until it broke. His pack shifted violently, and the waist belt cut deep into his abdomen as the load hammered his spine again and again. His oxygen mask was torn from his face, the hose snapping loose. What remained was a long, uncontrolled slide, broken by repeated brutal impacts, each one adding damage until nothing remained to stop the motion. We break down failures like this all the time, where shortcuts and hidden decisions turn routine climbs into fatal ones. If you want to understand how Everest really works when systems break, consider subscribing. A Swiss climber's helmet camera recorded 12 seconds of it. 2 orange figures slid sideways across the slope. A sharp metallic sound cut through the wind as an ice axe hit stone and was ripped away. Then the frame filled with blowing snow and a fixed rope snapping and shaking under gusts. Farther down the ridge, another team saw brief movement through the fog and knew someone had fallen. They radioed up the line, asking if anyone was missing. Minutes later, a Sherpa descending from above reached Pema, jammed against rock with a loose rope end and broken gear hanging from his harness. He clipped Pema into an anchor, checked him quickly, and reported the situation. The first distress call reached Camp 4 in about 10 minutes, passed hand to hand through climbers who still had working radios and enough oxygen left to speak clearly. No rescue could be sent toward Leo's last known position that day. The north face was lost in whiteout, with winds strong enough to knock climbers sideways. Helicopters could not fly that high in thin air and heavy wind. A ground search would have meant leaving the fixed ropes, crossing unknown terrain, and stepping into a steep fall path filled with blowing snow. That would have put more people at risk. Expedition leaders shifted from rescue to control. Radios were used to confirm who was accounted for on the ridge. Teams above and below the area were told to stop moving when possible. Sherpas closest to the site checked laterally whenever visibility opened, while others descended to pass messages. As the weather held, efforts focused on tracking what had happened rather than moving into the fall zone. Radio calls were logged. Climbers near the area were asked what they saw and when. Camp 4 checked head counts and oxygen use to make sure no one else was missing. The Swiss team handed over helmet camera footage that showed the sideways movement and the slide. Wind erased footprints on the ridge within hours, but Pema's position and broken hardware near a rock ledge marked the point of failure. That same day, staff began reviewing guide lists. It quickly became clear that the guide named in the contract was not on the mountain. By the time conditions eased, word had already spread through base camp. The agency blamed sudden weather and route confusion, but climbers compared details among themselves. Video surfaced of Pema being questioned near the dining tents, unable to read a GPS unit or explain his choices. The focus shifted away from the storm and toward how an unqualified person ended up guiding a client in the death zone. Within days, workers from neighboring camps confirmed his actual role as a kitchen helper with no experience above the lower camps. Word spread quickly. Authorities and regulators demanded documentation from the agency. By the end of the season, the incident was openly discussed at base camp and across climbing forums, not as a freak accident, but as a failure created by a concealed substitution that only became lethal once weather erased the route and judgment mattered most. Leo's death itself remained unresolved for months. 3 months later, a Chinese recovery team working on the north side of the mountain reported human remains surfacing from ice and rock roughly 2,800 meters below the ridge. Seasonal melt and slow ice movement had pushed fragments of torn-down suit, webbing, and oxygen hardware into view. The team approached cautiously on fixed ropes, installing anchors and treating the site as unstable terrain rather than a single recovery point. The body was badly damaged by the fall and prolonged exposure, but identification was confirmed through serial numbers on oxygen components, a sewn name tag inside the suit, and cross-checking with expedition records. Recovery took multiple stages over several days, lowering the remains to a safer altitude for documentation before transfer. The location and condition confirmed what climbers already knew. Leo had not survived the fall, and there had never been a window in which rescue was possible. The post-mortem report stated that Leo died instantly from internal decapitation, caused by extreme bending forces during the first major impact. Although the skin of the neck remained mostly intact, the skull and upper spine were no longer connected inside the body. The report also documented severe blunt force trauma. both femurs shattered into multiple pieces, the pelvis broken, the rib cage collapsed, and fatal injuries to the lungs and heart. Large areas of skin were stripped away where his clothing tore during the slide. These injuries matched the terrain and the video evidence of a long, uncontrolled fall over rock and ice. Cold preserved the body in a curled position where it came to rest. Investigators noted this was a physical effect of freezing, not evidence of awareness after the fatal injury. The investigation focused on the sequence and equipment. Radio logs and witness statements placed the route deviation within minutes of a sudden whiteout that buried the fixed line. Hardware recovered near the rock outcrop showed a fractured carabiner with no visible certification markings and a brake pattern consistent with shock loading in extreme cold. The short rope setup funneled all force through that single connector. Review of the GPS unit seen later at base camp showed it was a basic consumer device, but staff interviews confirmed Pema had not been trained to use it. Agency records revealed that the named guide was not on the mountain and that management knowingly substituted an unqualified worker, a decision investigators described as deliberate misrepresentation driven by cost and refund avoidance. Under pressure, the agency issued partial refunds and provided documents to regulators. Climbing organizations used the case in safety briefings on guide, verification, and rope systems. In Ohio, Leo's engineering firm reviewed his recent projects and found a consistent pattern of overbuilt safety margins, written plainly to account for human error. Within a year, his family formed the Leo Vance Foundation, which funded GPS training, independent credential checks, and third-party verification for commercial expeditions rather than climbs. The case stayed in circulation not because Everest changed, but because it showed how a hidden substitution can survive routine systems and only reveal itself when weather removes every remaining margin. The decision that killed Leo Vance was not made in the death zone. It was made months earlier, on paper, when the mistake could still have been undone. By the time the mountain revealed it, everyone else already knew, and there was no way back. Thank you for watching. If you like this episode, check these other videos.